Hi, my name is Katrina, and welcome to The Weapons We Become, an artist talk with PJ Anderson with the Manitoba Craft Council. The Manitoba Craft Council was founded in 1978 as Manitoba's only not-for-profits organization dedicated exclusively to contemporary craft. We are gathered here today in what we now know as Manitoba, the ancestral heritage of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, Desulene, Nahetuak, Inuit peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. These lands occupy territory subject to treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. Craft occupies a space that is its hand and the handmade at its center. It rejoices in sharing knowledge and solving problems. It stems from, creates, and nurtures community. It allows us to build bridges through shared action, but also foster courage, empathy, and connection. We acknowledge the deep harms caused by settlement, and we look forward to using craft in our efforts toward reconciliation and positive change. I'm going to welcome PJ Anderson today. PJ Anderson is a Caribbean Métis artist from Thompson, Manitoba, Canada. She is shown internationally as a resident artist at the University of KwaZulu Natal in South Africa, China, as a finalist in the International Ceramic Magazine's Editor Association Emerging Artist Competition, and the United States Unwedged at Pottery Northwest across Canada. She has lectured for the University of Manitoba, the University of KwaZulu Natal, for the Manitoba Craft Council, and the Manitoba Craft Museum and Library. She teaches ceramics for both the City of Winnipeg and Winnipeg Art Gallery. She's the current director at large for NCECA, National Council for the Education in Ceramic Arts, and is the incumbent director for programming for NCECA 2024 to 2027. She's a recent MFA graduate from the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. We have auto closed captioning available for this talk if you turn it on in the settings in YouTube. And we'll have a Q&A session through the chat to follow the talk. So you need to be logged into YouTube to use the chat. So if you think you're going to have questions, log in now. And I'm going to put it over to PJ. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, let's get started. So, your story matters more than you know. This is a quote from Sandra Whiting, who is a storyteller from Jamaica. Oh, sorry, hold on. Hit a weird button. So, what is a story? So, story is a lesson, a history. A story is able to give us community, tells us about our people, what we value, and what's important to us. It's going to tell us how to feel joy and how to express grief. A story is a bundle of words that identify a people. Through choosing of the story, it identifies your relationship to those people. Every story is a choice and a decision to share a specific way of seeing the world. So if you ask anybody from my particular generation, we're going to probably say that some of the most memorable stories from our childhood came from the National Film Board of Canada. We have the Log Driver's Waltz, we have the House Hippo, the Cat Came Back, those lovely Heritage Canada moments, Dr. Penfield, a small burnt toast. Every single one of those is a very fundamental part to who we see ourselves as Canadians of a certain generation. Reminds me of having only 12 channels and having to stand up and go across the room and turn the button, of really wanting nothing more than a house hippo for some reason. So we could probably think of all of these things as a foundation for my identity as a Canadian. When I think about home, this is probably what I'm thinking when I think of Canada. It's only part of my story and really only part of my identity, and part of your story and only part of your identity. But these stories, like all stories, are designed to give me a sense of community, to share an experience, a lexicon for how to interact with the world, what behavior is appropriate, what's frowned upon, what parts of my history are important to be shared, and of course, cautionary tales. So far, all stories are important. Some different stories that have added to my sense of identity, sense of self, and sense of home are the stories from my parents. My father is from West Africa via the Caribbean, Jamaican. And my mother is a Métis person from the Red River Valley. We also have some Euro mixed, mostly from Great Britain. Now, my parents had certain stories that were told to me, but they were told through a very Western perspective. There we go. Sorry. At home, my mother taught me how to wrap a sari because when she was a young woman, her best friend was from India. My mom helped me read Roots when I was 10 because I was a very precocious child, and that is not a book you could tackle on your own. And my mom was also responsible for all of our travel. She made sure that we went to see lots of different places. We did the classic road trips in our minivan with the wood paneling. And she wanted to make sure that our stories weren't the only stories we ever heard, and that our stories were not the only perspective that someone could say. Whereas from my father's side, I got some Anansi stories. Now, Anansi is not a Jamaican story. It's a Ghanaian story and a Khan story. But that story managed to filter all the way down so that my dad was able to tell me. Of course, Jamaica, we also learned a lot about music, Jamaican music, reggae, and ska. We also learned all the dances that went with, old dances, not new dances. And those are very much based and patterned after the rhythms of drums from West Africa. And of course, the food. My dad also taught me how to cook. And we cooked many, many foods that were, of course, coming from Africa. So what we are seeing here, this difference between the amount of things my father was able to tell me about his people's story and the amount of things my mother was able to tell me about her people's story is pretty telling. So all of this culture that my mom and my dad both experienced was seen through a filter, a colonial filter. In my dad's case, it was more like a colonial colander where lots got through. In my mom's case, it was more of a colonial coffee filter where not a whole heck of a lot went through. Now, it wasn't that she didn't want to tell me these stories, but she didn't know them because they weren't told to her, because we had something that we call a fractured continuity of knowledge. Having not all of that in my head, I was off to art school, where I was really interested in studying the works of Indigenous peoples and of people of African descent. Unfortunately, at the time, back in 1997, there wasn't a lot available. There was a few classes here or there, but not a ton. So I did what I could. I studied a lot of art history. I took a lot of drawing. I was a painter back then, and a lot of the work that I was painting was about my family's coming to Canada, what their experience was like before they came to Canada, in Jamaica, and then here. But eventually, you have to take your 3D. They won't let you graduate without it. So I ended up taking ceramics. And in ceramics, during my very first project, a coiling project, my professor asked me if I'd ever heard of Magdalena Adundo. And of course I hadn't. My teacher then told me that Magdalena Adundo is probably the best coil potter in the world. Now, all of that is true. Absolutely true. But this was the very first time in my entire life, and this is not hyperbole. Usually I hyperbole, but this is not hyperbole. The first time in my life that anyone had ever given me a Black artist as a measure of excellence. The first time. So for me, what that was saying was that ceramics is a place where Black people go, or a place where Black people thrive, or where Black people can be excellent. So I stuck it out. I started researching as much as I could, in those little short chapters and foundation textbooks that we had, and occasional books here and there, because the internet is not what it is now. And I found some spectacular artists I'd never heard of before. I had Lady Kowali, Magdalena Adundo, Nesta Nala, Augusta Savage, and the very famous Dave the Enslaved. Now, all of these people are Black people who had been making excellent ceramics or oh, in some cases with traditions that have been passed down thousands and thousands of years. Now, on that note, I also started noticing that we had a whole bunch of very famous indigenous potters, or at least pottery styles. So I ended up finding Maria Martinez, who's from San Ildefonso, Margaret Tafoya from Santa Clara. There's the traditional Acoma pots, the traditional Hopi pot, the Kachikli figurines, and the Haudenosaunee, who are part of the Canadian, well, not so much Canadian, but making amazing, amazing pottery that I had never even known about. And if you take a look at all of these pots, almost every single one of them is coiled. That's what I did. I'm a coil potter. So, in my excitement, I started playing with this coil, seeing what kind of forms and what kind of shapes I can get. What kind of surfaces can I make? Can I get one of those buttery, smooth, burnished surfaces that I'd seen in some of those other pots? What kind of firings can I do? What kind of patterns can I get from these smoke-fired ceramics? Now, at the time, the University of Manitoba, alma mater, was a high fire school. Most universities were at the time. Very much invested in wood firing, gas kilns, porcelains, stonewares, beautiful glazes like celadons and chinos, and all of that is fantastic. But none of that was really what I was interested in. Fortunately, I had some pretty good teachers who were able to sort of send me in the right direction. They knew stuff about low fire pottery, but if it's not your thing, it's not your thing. So they just gave me some directions. And I ended up using something called a message board. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a message board before, but you go on the internet and you type a question, and strangers from around the world answer the question for you. So if I had some questions about how to make a beautiful terrazza gelata for my burnished pots, that's where I would go. Fantastic resource. However, there was still something missing from this whole experience. When you think about art history, and you think about something specific, let's take Venetian glass. You don't just learn about Venetian glass, you learn about Venice. You learn about the political structure of Venice at the time that Venetian glass was a thing. You learn about the religions that are going on at the time. You learn about the friends and the foes that that particular area has and what it is that led to this particular type of glass becoming super famous worldwide. But I wasn't getting that from books. And I wasn't really getting that from the internet and message boards. Really kind of hard to get these kinds of stories when oral traditions are so prevalent amongst African and Indigenous peoples. It's not written down. So unless you sit down and listen to an elder tell a story, you're not going to know. But there was one place where I could find some stuff out at university, and that was the anthropology department. So I was able to turn every single class that I took into a pottery class. I was able to learn all about Indus Valley ceramics. I was able to learn about Egyptian ceramics from North Africa. I was able to learn New World ceramics like the Mayan and the Moche. And if you ever have time, please do yourself a favor and Google Moche pots. Bananas. So these stories I was starting to get versions of the stories that were pulled together with bits and pieces of evidence that they had buried around or bits of writing that happened to be left behind. So we know that all stories are important, but what we need to know now is the value of an unfiltered story. So remember how we were talking about with my mom and my dad, how my dad had a little bit of filter through colonialism, but it was still pretty recognizably African, and how my mom was much filtered through colonialism, and we had very little that made it through. So stories from school were pretty much being told from a colonial perspective, and they've been given to me as though they're mine. So I was invited as a research assistant with Dr. Kent Fowler, who's the resident pottery expert of Manitoba. And he was studying Zulu potters, their migrations. And one of the things he was looking at was how they taught pottery intergenerationally. So this was fantastic for me. I got a chance to go all the way to Africa, which was super cool. And I got to go and learn from traditional potters in South Africa. So we learned the whole gamut. So the harvesting, the processing, the forming, the burnishing, the firing. We got to see everything. And I also got a chance to go and look at historical collections, museum collections, private collections. So I got to see the way these pots had been made hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years ago versus the kinds of pots that are being made right now. I spent a lot of time with these women, having them show me how to make a pot exactly the way they would show their daughter-in-law. So that is how it's passed on for the most part in Zulu culture. The daughter-in-law takes on the styles of the family that she moves to. So they were showing me how to make a pot the way that that family would make that pot. That wasn't the only thing that I learned there. I also got to listen to everybody gossiping while they were making pots and telling pottery jokes. Now, admittedly, I had a translator, so I didn't understand all of it, but there's a lot of pottery jokes that are pretty universal. I also got to see how the whole community got together. One of the granddaughters was grinding the clay in order to make a really soft slurry. How some of the younger children were bringing water over so that the older ladies could make the pots, that jokes were happening as all of this is going on. Like, it was a community event. It was fantastic. So when I came home, I started thinking about weaponized access, thinking about things that I don't have access to, weaponizing them against the previous versions. So taking aspects of, say, our culture and telling us that they are bad or evil because they are not part of the Western culture. Taking something that's essential to life and using it against you, like water, for example, which is the water pitchers that I have right here. I made them bladed and weaponized so that you couldn't actually access that thing that you needed to survive. I call this whole weaponized access the Nestle stratagem for obvious reasons. I returned in 2012 to South Africa. At this time, I was the artist in residence. So, whereas before I got to work with rural women in their rural villages, learning how to make pots, now I was learning from people who had gone through academia, who were learning in a Western style. But a lot of those people had come from these rural and traditional teachings. So they had this fantastic blend of the two. I also got a chance to spend some time with Juliet Armstrong, who was an amazing woman, one of my favorite people and a mentor. She supports Zulu potters and brings them all, or brought them all over the world so they could be shown and known internationally. Fantastic. We lost her in 2012, but I still think highly of her and love her to pieces. She's amazing. Again, this was just like a regular school. We still had our weird pottery kitchen parties where we would cook food in the kilns. We would still have firings outside that were group events. I would still have, late night conversations with the graduate students that were there. And I still was able to go and visit other rural potting families like the Magwaza family that I didn't get a chance to see the first time around. Another thing I saw my second time was not only the hippopotamuses that broke into my hotel, which was super uncomfortable for me, but I also started noticing how much weaving there was. Now, I don't know how I didn't notice it before because it's literally everywhere. They weave with everything. They weave with wires, they weave with grasses, with leaves, they weave with plastic bags. Everywhere is weaving. And in some cases, they're using that weaving in order to complete a pot. So these are some beer vessels, And you would put these lids on, these woven lids, to keep the bugs out of your beer, as one does. So with that connection in mind, I started thinking about how much weaving was a thing here in North America and how big a part of our communities and our culture, this weaving of baskets for carrying things, for bowls, for ceremony, how important those two aspects were. And I started experimenting with combining the weaving with the pottery. So since weaving and pottery are both such huge parts of both African traditions and North American traditions, I felt like I could bring those two practices together, those two parts of self, into one. So I was blending my traditionalities, I guess you could say. Finding two different ways of solving a problem that are complementary and work together. Now, all stories are important. The value of unfiltered stories, weaponization of access, and synergism of identities. I'm so sorry. I wish I could find a better word than synergism, but that was really the only one that worked. So now I want to take you over to the politics of pottery. It was about this time that I started trying to make that connection between what was going on in the world around me and my work. Now, I thought that maybe I could take the things that were going on and think about some of the unconventional weaponizations that were happening around me. Not the overt stuff, not like the actual guns, like whatever, but the things that were a little more subtle than that. Things that might only be a weapon in certain contexts, or might be a weapon only to certain people. So, first example, of course, is the red hat. I mean, before 2016, there was nothing weird about a red hat. There was no pause, there was no thought. But now, if you see a red hat or a bunch of red hats, then you're going to, if you are me, who's a Black Indian woman, um, definitely have some feelings about that. We've got the black hoodie. Now, there's really nothing threatening at all about a black sweater. Nothing. But for some reason, a black sweater in some communities means that people have the right to shoot you for buying candy. You have the right to be murdered because you are wearing a black hoodie, even children, especially children. Then we have washrooms. A significant portion of our population having to go to the washroom is a literal life or death situation. Having to pee and choosing wrong means that you might end up murdered. Like, that's it. Murdered. Done. For having to pee. And of course, we've got our oil trucks. Now, for most of the world, an oil truck is just a truck. But if you happen to, I don't know, live on land that they want to put some pipelines through, suddenly this oil truck means attack on your sovereignty, bringing poisons into the land where your children live. So these are unconventional weaponizations because under any other circumstances, not one of them would be threatening. So this was all around 2016. Everything started to just get weird. We had Charlottesville riots where Nazis showed up again. Idle No More, Dakota Access Pipeline, missing murdered Indigenous women, the deaths of trans women, and, as I was lucky enough to experience myself, the El Paso shooting. And not myself, but I was in the town at the time. I'd recently gotten a grant to study Indigenous pottery and weaving like I had when I was in South Africa. Very excited. So I headed off to the New Mexico Center for Archaeological Research. That was literally the first thing that I did. I didn't even go to my Airbnb. They were having a lunch and learn on the traditional dyeing practices of Central America. And this lecture was being given by a woman named Mary Weaki. Mary Weaki is a Comanche archaeologist, and she was very, very helpful. She was able to give me access to their collections, their archives, and she was also able to connect me with a program that was put on by the Heard Museum. Now, the Heard Museum had an endowment that paid elders to teach youth traditional craft practices so that they wouldn't disappear. I also had a chance to go and visit a bunch of different reservations. I was able to go and visit galleries. I was able to visit museums, special collections, get a whole bunch of stuff. One of the things I heard about when I was in New Mexico was a Mata Ortiz workshop that was happening in El Paso, Texas. Mata Ortiz is a Mexican pottery style. It is had a resurgence in the last few decades. Coiled and burnished pottery, super amazing. So off I went to El Paso, Texas. And yeah, during the middle of our workshop, my phone went off. That was an active shooter. And the Walmart shooter who was shooting Latinos was about 15 minutes away from where we were. This was the first time I'd ever really been in a situation like this. I'm Canadian. This doesn't happen very often here. Like it's very, very rare. But everyone was very calm. They turned off the lights and we continued making our pots. And I literally went home very shortly after. It was a very interesting experience, but it stayed with me. I started making my glorification series. Now, the glorification series was all about this almost sexual fetishism for relationship with violence that I see a lot with these shooter events and this attachment to weapons and the need for the weapons to be accessible at all times. And I was trying to see if I could make them almost a sacred object, just to experience what that might be like to have a sacred object that is also responsible for murdering a great many people in the wrong hands. All right. So we've discussed all stories being important. We've discussed the value of unfiltered stories. We've talked about the weaponization of access. And we've talked about the synergism of identity. We've talked about the politics of pottery. And now I want to take you to the future history of our stories. Yeah, so in 2020, I was off to graduate school back at the University of Manitoba, just at the very beginning of COVID. We stopped interacting in real life, all of a sudden, out of nowhere. We just stopped. I had met some of my cohort 3 times that year in real life because the rest of the time we were all online. I began to think about how things are weaponized in digital spaces, like social media, Instagram, the Reddits, brigading, doxing. And if one were to describe the weaponization of digital space, how would you do it? What would you say? Put together an idea of weaponizing digital space. Well, I chose to think first about the heroes and the warriors that were fighting the good fight. Formerly on Twitter, they used to be amazing people that would have glorious, drawn out, days long battles with all sorts of terrible, terrible people. We have some fantastic essayists on YouTube. I always wanted to think about them as a powerful people, a powerful statement that they were making, because they're putting their actual real lives in danger to speak out against sorts of bigotry. So I started creating these figures. I have a keyboard warrior. I've got robot armor. I've got Liberty, who is fighting the good fight. Now I have the ultimate of keyboard warriors, who embodies all the things that I need this warrior to do. I describe these figures with clay and fiber, using all that intergenerational knowledge that I've been working on all this time. This intergenerational knowledge, it kind of makes me think, okay, when you were young, you were making cookies with your grandma. All right, just go with me. This is wonderful. You're making cookies with your grandma. You're a big kid. You get to like put in like the chocolate chips or the raisins. You get to lick the bowl after. You get to eat the cookies with milk and hang out with grandma. And at the end of the day, that experience has colored the way you see cookies, right? You're going to have a favorite because you and grandma made cookies when you were 6 and it was amazing. So not only is that going to color how you feel about cookies, but your relationship with grandma is actually going to color your relationship with the world. Your whole future now is going to be about how that was such a wonderful experience for you. Even if you had the exact recipe in your hands written out for you, it would not be the same cookie as the cookies you made with grandma, right? So it's really not about the cookies. It's about the relationship that you had with your grandparent. And that is sort of like how intergenerational knowledge works. So grandma's cookies to think about how we will be experiencing the internet. But using intergenerational knowledge to describe the way we are interacting with each other in an unreal space. Yeah, it was weird for me too. I liked it. So while I'm thinking about what we are doing in these digital spaces, I'm also thinking about what we would do to try to protect ourselves as best that we could. Trying to filter out our toxicity, try and filter out the toxicity of the situations around us, and try to hide behind our keyboards. Those are all things that have happened over the last few years. I have also know people that have created new faces, new avatars, new people to be online once they've burned a specific bridge. Yes, we would be searching for real connections with anyone, even if they're terrible, even if they are toxic. We will still search for those connections. What do we do now? All stories are important. There's value in unfiltered stories. We have the weaponization of access, synergism of identity, the politics of pottery, and the future history of our stories. There we go. So, well, I think I'm missing a page here. So, having lived through all of the lockdowns, the solitude, the relationships that have strengthened and those have shattered under the strain of the last few years, losing friends and family to things like extremism. They never would have been felt by this before, but the solitude will get to some people more than others. We weren't really paying attention to the crux of the matter here. We've kept a record, and the internet is forever. You've all heard it. Detailed record of who we are and who we were for anyone to see for generations in the last 3 years. So our stories matter more than you know. And these last few years are our version of grandma's cookies. Stories, experiences that will be passed down, worldviews, beliefs, traditions, practices, institutions are all going to be transmitted and put into practice based on what we've collectively put into it. I'm not really sure what the next series of work will take me. I don't think I'm finished with how digital experiences affect the real world and vice versa, but I guarantee that I will continue to seek out the unfiltered and unadulterated stories and imagine what those future historians are going to be thinking about this story. Oh, thank you all very much. If you have any questions.
Hi, PJ. Great talk. I have a few questions. There's a little delay before we get questions. So I have a couple of my own questions. So I'm really curious about how you studied weaving and ceramics techniques from the Zulu, from indigenous people in America, it sounds like North America, and then also colonialist clay practices. So I'm super curious about how they are different and the same to each other. It sounds like in the Zulu and the indigenous cultures, there's a lot more of a community aspect, it sounds like, for sure. But I just thought I'd pick about that for my own curiosity.
One of the things about clay is it is a community building activity. I can't really think of the people on earth who've ever worked with clay who haven't done it with an entire slew of people. It's a very labor intensive process, like extremely so. Digging up the clay, processing clay, making things, firing, those can be day-long processes of just firing clay. So almost every community is going to be, or any clay community is going to be a community. I think that the major difference is that going to an Indigenous group and hearing their stories about why they harvest the clay and the stories about what areas they can go to and when they can harvest and why they do things the way they do, and hearing the same or similar stories coming from Zulu ladies is very much like what I would get in university. Like, this is why you can't mix these two chemicals together. It'll make a terrible glaze. It's just given differently. There is an aspect of history that is with the other two, whereas with the university, while it is historical, there are like histories of people making pots and doing things, it's delivered not necessarily by people who grew up or were part of that community, if that makes sense.
It does. I did a craft-based education as well. So like within that, I feel like they always talk about these cultures like they don't exist anymore almost.
Right.
Whereas like as I move
through still here.
the world more and get to learn more from talks like this and lots of other things, I'm really like, you come to the conclusion like, oh, most of these or many of them still exist and are being practiced today. And they're kind of talking about it like in the olden days.
Like 400 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, but it's really like women doing it right now who could be telling us about this, which is really fascinating.
And they absolutely are. They absolutely are still doing it. Almost everywhere. I mean, to be fair, though, it is an increasingly vanishing practice. These traditional clay practices, actually a lot of traditional craft practices are vanishing, just as people's grandchildren are off to university and they're not learning stuff from grandma the way we used to do it back in the day. And it's not necessarily bad.
There's like a de-skilling happening, like,
or a different set of skills. It's a different set of skills. And it breaks my heart a little bit because like I know that we don't have records of some of these practices. And I know once they're gone, and we'll never get that back. But at the same time, I can't really begrudge someone of sending, their grandchildren off to Western school so they can get a job in IT and support a family, right? Like,
people do what they have to do, right? Like you have to survive. You have to, but it's I feel like there's this idea in like not in craft culture, but in like general society where it's like, well, we have better stuff now. And I'm like, no, we don't.
We have different
better stuff. We really don't. Or like, my MacBook's pretty amazing or whatever. But like, if we're talking about craft, the quality of craft overall has gone down since the Industrial Revolution. A lot of those things are dying out. So it's also really exciting to hear that they're being like, the oral history was also quite interesting because once that's gone, it's gone. So it's exciting to hear that people are going to study these things to make sure that even if the people who are doing them die away, we at least have some information about what they do. But interesting. I also found it really interesting that you're doing a digital talk, like doing this talk digitally, and how you were talking about like the digital weapons and the weaponization of digital spaces. I found very like, ironic's probably the wrong word, but like it fits, right? And I found it so interesting that you were talking about, like, it had not occurred to me this, like, I know what doxing is, but it hadn't occurred to me that like there's always this common idea that if you're on the computer defending a group or something, that you're kind of being a coward. But it had never occurred to me that on this online space, like, kind of not though. Like, people can find you, especially if you're like, if you have like an anonymous handle, they can still find you, but not as easily. But if you're using your own info, which a lot of people are, like, people can find you, which is
absolutely
a bit scary. I would love to hear a little bit more about this idea of like searching for connections, even if they're toxic, which is a very human thing to do. Like, we attach to our parents, even if they're terrible, because we have to. Do you think that this sort of like, the last 5 years online have been pretty like wild.
Bananas.
Do you think that like looking for connections because we've all been trapped inside has like, is that part of the reason in your opinion of all of this toxicity? Like people are looking for anything kind of thing? Or is it
I feel like the modern age has been building to this for a while.
Mhm.
I like to think like, oh, 2016 is when everything turned around. It's like, no, that's when people just started being loud about it. Like they always did these things. They always were there. It never went away. It's just suddenly people were loud about it. And they had these platforms where their opinions have the same weight as everyone else's opinion. Right. So like suddenly, like, you know, your great Aunt Sally has the exact same value as like a literal doctor who's telling you to get a vaccine. But they're like, well, I don't know, both sides. Like, no, one of those is actually really well versed on this subject. But they have the same value.
But then the flip side is like oppressed voices who never get heard based on like gatekeeping, suddenly like those doors have opened and people can say whatever they want.
And they can be heard.
Yes.
They can be heard. I feel like for the last long while, the more digitally inclined we've become, the less tactilely inclined we've become. So we stopped making things with our hands as much. We've stopped engaging with people physically, the way, you know, hug, handshake, you know, those kinds of the French kissing on the cheeks thing. Like we don't do those things anymore.
Braiding hair, like all of these,
hair, right?
your friend's nails, like all of these little things that you do to like show care to people that are like not talking. They're just sort of like holding
They're
space.
just being together.
Yes.
That's it. But a lot of that we don't really do in the same way anymore. And I feel that it might be like the more digitally inclined we become, the less reality inclined we become. But that is a little bit of a problem since humans really need human interaction and they really need touch and community. So in these sorts of instances, we're going to search out community anywhere we can. So if you find someone who tells you you're right and I got your back, then it really doesn't matter what it is that they're telling you you're right about. It just matters that you have a buddy in your corner. And that is a connection that you need, no matter how toxic or terrible it might be.
And people are much more bold online too. Like,
oh, absolutely.
In real life, I don't get yelled at very often in my everyday life, you know? Like people might be a little snippy with you or something, but like people tend to be, even if people are telling you information you don't want to hear in real life, they tend to be polite and generally relatively respectful, right? And then you can respond to that however you may, and that happens how it happens. Online though, I feel like those like rules of decorum are just like out the window, which is really, it's like good in some ways and bad in other ways. It's good in some ways because people who don't maybe feel like they're able to do that in their real life can, but then it's bad because everyone gets so incredibly defensive that it makes it hard to like work through the point or like kind of like, it's a very, I really like this idea of like digital weapons because, and like also like you're saying, if someone is accepting you into the group, suddenly these people who have these little fringe, like terrible interests or fringe beliefs are finding these huge pools of people that they can pull together with and aren't really getting like regular people talking to them, right? So I thought it was very interesting.
Those really super fun algorithms that help you find things that you're interested in also tend to put you in these echo chambers where you just hear your own opinions parroted back to you. So it's really hard to have a good perspective of what's happening, like a balanced perspective, because all of your media is just giving you what you already think you know. And it's a design feature, like they did it on purpose. It's supposed to work like that.
I intentionally will like follow people who aren't like you have to like see, I'm like a white settler, and to see BIPOC content online, I have to like, I've spent years like you know what I mean? And then now it's like organically giving it to me, but it was like a little appalling to me when I was like, wait a second, like I'm only seeing other white settler content, which is like fine, but also like not actually what I want. And you know what I mean? And
I do, because I also got the white settler content for a very long time.
And you're like, you're
I
like,
know
oh,
there's other brown people here. Where are they?
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's even more reprehensible in your case, because you're just like wading through the sea of settlers being like, where are my people at?
But remember I was talking about like back in the day, like trying to find Black artists?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how long it took me to find like 1,000 Black artists on Instagram? Like one day. One day. There's like
Yes.
thousands of Black artists. There's thousands of artists of color. And I
Mm-hmm.
can find them so easily. I can have conversations. These can be my friends. I can join groups and I can start
Resource sharing.
you know, it's so easy to get these connections. Whereas I remember feeling like I was the only brown potter on earth. And like nobody liked anything I was doing. It's like, why are you doing all that backwards stuff? All that primitive art. And like actual words people have said. And
Oh,
I
I
couldn't
believe you.
find anyone else who was interested in the things that I was doing. You know,
Mhm.
actual things are, well, it's your own fault. I mean, who makes that kind of stuff anymore? Actual things that have been said about the stuff that I make.
And often BIPOC, not exclusively, obviously, but a lot of BIPOC people make craft is like a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a craft council, we are also thinking about this, like the fact there's like the craft and fine arts sort of hierarchy, which we obviously don't believe in, right? But then there's like another layer to that, which is we've noticed that since there's been a real push in the last 5 years to have significantly more BIPOC representation, that suddenly lots of like fine arts institutions are showing tons of craft. And that's been really a really interesting thing we've observed. And they've sort of been having to, I think a lot of institutions are having to deconstruct that idea in order to bring in these like equity mandates. And we as people who've been advocating for craft for a long time are like, this is really interesting to kind of watch.
It's like, it's really good. It's like,
Mhm.
I feel like I've been saying this for like 20 years and no one listened. No one listened.
I'm sure I believe you.
No, I'm not saying that you don't believe me.
Yeah.
I'm just saying
Oh,
that I feel
of
like I'm
course.
shouting into the dark. And like
You're like,
these things that are
we
important,
exist. And everyone's like, what?
I think they're
Also,
important, and they are. They
and
are.
like, I really enjoyed you talking a little bit about how the internet isn't like it used to be, because like message boards and stuff, like you couldn't just go online and find, like you're saying, you couldn't just go online and find 1,000 Black ceramic artists. Like they just didn't, that wasn't a thing. You had to actually know people. And in the case that you were in, you had to go to other parts of the world because that information was so limited.
It's so fun. It's like I'm
Yeah.
a member of NCECA, which is this large ceramics organization. They do conferences from all over the world. And I remember like writing grants in order to get money to go to learn from South African potters. And now like we just bring South African potters to the conference and have them show in front of all these people. I'm like, what? That was an option? I didn't.
But it's so exciting. It's like change in progress too, you
It
know? Like we're
is.
seeing the
It
progress.
is. It's like it's a mixed blessing because I remember how hard I had to work in order to find any of this and how not unsupportive, but like disinterested a lot of people were in supporting this kind of research and this kind of knowledge. And the last few years, like the uptick in interest has been amazing. It's been super great and feeling super supportive, lots of opportunities that I never would have had before, and a lot of these fantastic artists who never would have had a voice now are. But again, it's like it's just I remember how hard it was. How hard it was. And
Yes.
now it's just here. It's just here. The culmination of all the work. It's just here. It's just here.
So beautiful to have like a thing come full circle.
Yeah. Yeah. Good times.
Good times. This was just an absolutely fantastic talk. I also want to mention that I remember message boards, and that part of your talk did make me laugh. The old internet, as we call it now, the old internet, where it was
like,
actually
I'm going on MSN to talk with my friends.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yep. Just a reminder though, once you guys are all done listening to our talk, today is the very first episode of the Great Canadian Pottery Throwdown on CBC Jam, so you should go and watch it.
You have two Manitoba potters. Two Manitoba potters. Jen Sonnenberg and Kiefer Florio. So go check them out.
100%. Thank you
And
again for asking me. This was wonderful.
thank you for having such a fabulous talk with us.
So.